The autumn wind swept across the excavation site in rural Pennsylvania, carrying the scent of damp soil and decaying leaves as Dr. Sarah Mitchell wiped perspiration from her brow and leaned closer to the exposed stones. She had been carefully brushing away centuries of compacted earth, revealing what appeared to be the forgotten foundation of a homestead long swallowed by time. Until now, the dig had been unremarkable. The finds typical remnants of America's industrial-era pottery shards, corroded nails fragments of everyday life. But then James, her ambitious graduate student, called out with urgency in his voice. Sarah crossed the frosted ground, her boots crunching on the brittle surface to where James knelt beside a crumbling stone wall. His gloved hands trembled slightly as he lifted an object hidden within the loosened masonry, a leather-bound book darkened and swollen from years of damp confinement. It was tucked behind the stone, almost as if someone meant for it to stay hidden. He explained his excitement barely contained. Sarah took the artifact gingerly, feeling the surprising weight of the small album. The cracked leather cover still bore a tarnished brass clasp, aged green, but remarkably strong. The rest of the excavation team gathered, drawn by the discovery, as the gray November sky stretched over the rolling Pennsylvania hills and skeletal trees. This land had witnessed centuries of layered history. Native American settlements, colonial farms, Civil War encampments, and thriving industrial towns. Yet it seemed it still had one final secret to share. With deliberate care, Sarah opened the clasp. The first page revealed an inscription, its ink faded, but still legible. The Whitmore family, 1902. She turned the page and the air in the tent grew still. A photograph of a girl no more than 8 years old looked out at them. She stood in a garden, smiling directly at the camera, her expression startlingly modern in its brightness and confidence. Later, under the glow of an LED lamp in the field tent, Sarah eased the photograph from its mounting while the others crowded around the makeshift table. For its time, the image was of extraordinary quality, suggesting expensive equipment. The girl wore a finely made white dress trimmed with lace, her dark hair arranged in neat ringlets, but it was her smile that gripped them all, timeless, radiant, and alive. "Look at her expression," murmured Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the historian. "Children of that era almost always appear stiff or solemn, but she looks so contemporary." James adjusted the lamp to illuminate the image further. Her clothing and hairstyle fit the period perfectly. Everything matches historically. Sarah peered at the background through her magnifying glass. Behind the girl loomed a grand two-story home with wide wraparound porches, the kind owned by prosperous American families at the dawn of the 20th century. The photograph, it seemed, carried with it more than just an image. It hinted at a story that time had tried but failed to bury. Gardens stretched in tidy rows behind the girl, and just beyond them, Sarah could discern the faint outline of what appeared to be a carriage house. Elizabeth, absorbed in her tablet, spoke thoughtfully as she scrolled through local historical archives. "The Whitmore family," she murmured. "I'm checking against regional records, but in 1902, this area wasn't densely settled, mostly farmland and the beginnings of small mining communities." The photograph itself possessed an almost otherworldly aura, so well preserved that it seemed as if the picture had been captured yesterday instead of more than a century ago. The clarity was uncanny, with no serious fading, no obvious deterioration, despite having been walled away for countless decades, maybe longer. Then Jennifer leaned forward, pointing carefully. "What's that she's holding?" Sarah brought the magnifying glass closer, and her pulse quickened as the object became clear. Resting in the child's hand was what looked like a locket. Yet something about its design struck Sarah as profoundly unsettling. Something out of place, something impossible. The team moved with solemn efficiency, setting up the high-resolution digital microscope to examine the photograph in detail. On the laptop screen, the enlarged image appeared in crisp resolution, exposing details the naked eye could never catch. Sarah's fingers hovered as she zoomed closer, and the silence inside the tent grew thick with anticipation. Then Elizabeth's voice broke through in a whisper of disbelief. "My God." The pendant came into focus, and its surface betrayed not the expected floral motif or religious emblem common to turn-of-the-century jewelry, but a sequence of engraved mathematical notations. Not random scribbles, not ornamental flourishes, but deliberate and structured equations. James adjusted his glasses, his voice catching as recognition set in. "These look like no. That's impossible." Sarah's hands trembled as she captured screenshots of the image, her mind racing. The symbols bore a striking resemblance to formulas in modern theoretical physics concepts and discoveries that would not emerge until decades after 1902. The notation, the precise arrangement of variables, everything suggested knowledge far beyond the time in which the photograph had been taken. Could this be some elaborate hoax, Jennifer asked, though even as the words left her mouth, they sounded weak. Elizabeth shook her head with certainty, her tone cutting through the air. "I've studied countless photographs from this period. The paper stock, the chemical processing, the way the light interacts with the emulsion, all of it is consistent with the early 20th century. Whatever this is, it's genuine. Everything about the photograph was consistent with 1902. No evidence of tampering, no telltale signs of forgery." Sarah quickly saved the high-resolution files onto multiple drives, her thoughts spinning faster than she could contain them. "We need to uncover everything about the Whitmore family property deeds, census records, newspaper archives, anything that could explain who this girl was and how she came to possess such a baffling object." Outside, the wind roared across the empty Pennsylvania fields, rattling the tent walls like a reminder of their isolation. On the table between them, the photograph seemed transformed. The girl's once bright smile now carrying an unsettling weight. What kind of people had the Whitmores been? What secrets had lingered here, hidden in the soil and stone of this countryside? The girl's eyes, fixed forever on the lens, seemed to meet theirs with a knowing gaze, as though she understood far more than her age should allow. By morning, the air was crisp, the sky a pale wash of November light, and the team threw themselves back into their work with renewed urgency. Sarah, having barely slept, moved between workstations at their base camp in the nearby town of Millbrook, her determination sharpened by fatigue. Elizabeth had risen before dawn, scouring the archives of the local historical society. Now, with the team gathered close, coffee steaming in their hands, she pointed to her laptop screen. "I found something. The Whitmore property was extensive, 247 acres, purchased in 1897 by Theodore Whitmore." Sarah leaned in. "What was his profession?" Elizabeth's eyes gleamed. "That's where it gets interesting. The records list him as an inventor and natural philosopher, a man of means whose family wealth came from textile mills in Massachusetts. But the paper trail was fractured, riddled with missing years and unexplained absences. Meanwhile, James had been chasing down genealogical leads. His voice broke the tense silence. "I found a birth record for Clara Whitmore, born in 1894. That would make her about 8 years old in 1902, exactly the age of the girl in our photograph. The pieces were falling into place, but each discovery seemed to deepen the mystery. Why would a child in rural Pennsylvania possess knowledge of equations that would not exist for another half-century? And why hide her likeness so deliberately behind stone?" Elizabeth leaned forward, her tone electric with anticipation. There's something else. Elizabeth's discovery from the Millbrook Gazette unsettled the entire team. In the autumn of 1902, neighbors had reported strange lights dancing across the Whitmore estate, flashes like lightning in clear skies and unsettling noises in the dead of night, mechanical whirring, electrical humming, disturbances so odd that the sheriff himself investigated, only to declare he found nothing amiss. Sarah felt a shiver crawl along her spine, one that had little to do with the biting wind outside their tent. This was no longer just an old photograph with a peculiar pendant. They were unraveling a century-old enigma, one that hinted at experiments and technologies far beyond the reach of the time. "We need to see the Whitmore property," Sarah declared firmly. "If there are answers, that's where we'll find them." The drive carried them deep into the Pennsylvania countryside, the road winding past weather-beaten barns and clapboard farmhouses that sagged with the weight of generations. Guided by the property records Elizabeth had uncovered, they eventually arrived at the remnants of the Whitmore estate. The house from the photograph was gone, likely torn down decades ago. Its memory preserved only in crumbling foundations, now hidden beneath ivy and thick brush. But scattered around the property were several surviving outbuildings, and one in particular caught their attention: a large workshop with a sturdiness that seemed out of step with its time. "Look at these walls," James muttered, running his gloved hand across the thick timber exterior. "This is overbuilt for 1902. This wasn't just a barn or a shed." Sarah tested the weathered wooden door, its iron hardware mottled with rust. The lock had corroded long ago, and with a groan that reverberated across the empty countryside, the door swung inward. What lay inside silenced them all. The space was expansive, with stone benches built into the walls and mounting points, suggesting that massive equipment had once been installed here. But it was the walls themselves that drew their breath. Slate panels stretching from floor to ceiling bore the faded remnants of chalk equations and intricate diagrams. Though time had eroded much of it, the complexity was undeniable. Symbols and formulas glimmered faintly in the dim light, impossibly advanced for 1902. Elizabeth lifted her camera, her voice hushed with awe. Theodore Whitmore wasn't tinkering. This was real research, serious, deliberate, and secret. Jennifer, exploring the far side of the room, called out suddenly. Half buried beneath collapsed timbers lay a dented metal container, its surface coated with a century's worth of grime and dust. "I think I found something," she said, her voice tight with both excitement and apprehension. The container was heavy, its construction deliberate, as though whoever built it had designed it to withstand time itself. Along one edge, stamped into the metal, was a single word: Whitmore. James's question broke the silence, his voice taut with anticipation. "Do we open it here?" Sarah glanced around the abandoned laboratory, its chalk-streaked walls and broken beams whispering of forgotten experiments. Then her eyes returned to the container in her hands. "Yes," she said firmly, "if we're going to understand what Clara was holding in that photograph, we need to see what her father left behind." With a metallic groan, the seal gave way, opening with ease that betrayed the craftsmanship of its design. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a cache of papers, photographs, and technical diagrams. The team spread the contents reverently across the cold stone table, their LED lights throwing sharp beams across the fragile documents. Theodore Whitmore's handwriting covered page after page, neat and precise, his words a window into experiments far ahead of their time. Elizabeth's voice trembled as she read aloud. September 15th, 1902. Today's experiments with electromagnetic field manipulation showed promising results. Energy transference efficiency has improved to nearly 40%. Clara continues to show remarkable aptitude for understanding the mathematical principles involved. Sarah's pulse quickened at the name. Clara. The little girl from the photograph had not only witnessed her father's work, she had been part of it. More images followed black and white glimpses into the workshop's past. Intricate electrical devices filled the space coils, wires, and apparatus that seemed decades too advanced for the age. In several photographs, Clara appeared beside her father, not as a passive child, but as an assistant, her small hands holding instruments, her eyes fixed on measurements. James, hunched over one of the diagrams, whispered as though afraid to break the spell. This schematic, it's a design for an electrical device. The principles are sound. This could have worked. But the final document froze them all in silence. A journal entry dated October 31st, 1902, written in frantic scrawl. They're coming for us. The government men have been asking questions in town about our work. I fear they see us as a threat. Clara understands what we must do. The knowledge must be preserved hidden until the world is ready. The weight of it sank in. Theodore Whitmore had not been a dreamer tinkering in isolation. He had been on the edge of discoveries powerful enough to draw the gaze of authorities, his work so radical it unsettled the power structures of his day. And in the face of that danger, he had chosen secrecy, burying his research, and perhaps much more in hopes that one day it would be found. The pendant in Clara's photograph was no trinket, Sarah realized, with a sudden clarity that made her breath catch. It was a cipher, her father's genius carved into metal equations and theories hidden in plain sight on his daughter's necklace. The autumn wind shrieked through the shattered rafters of the abandoned laboratory as the truth sank in. This was no longer about an odd historical curiosity. They were standing at the edge of a suppressed legacy, evidence of a visionary mind silenced, and of a child who had unknowingly carried the weight of discoveries that might have altered the path of history itself. Back at their research tent, the team threw themselves into unraveling the Whitmore mystery. Elizabeth had already reached out to the National Archives, asking for declassified material related to Theodore Whitmore or any references to unusual scientific activities in Pennsylvania at the turn of the century. Her announcement came sooner than expected, her eyes narrowing at the laptop screen. "There are files," she said grimly, "but most of them are still sealed. And the ones they released are so heavily redacted, they're nearly useless." What remained visible told a chilling story. In late 1902, federal investigators were probing what they described as potentially dangerous private experiments conducted by individuals operating outside government oversight. Theodore Whitmore's name surfaced repeatedly in those reports. Elizabeth read on, her voice heavy. According to this, they feared his electrical research could disrupt military communications, or worse, be weaponized. And remember, this was only a few years after the Spanish-American War. The government wasn't taking chances with anything that looked like a threat. Meanwhile, James had been combing through the Millbrook Gazette and uncovered corroborating evidence. In early November 1902, witnesses reported official carriages at the Whitmore property, investigators present for 3 days straight. Then suddenly, the account stopped. Sarah leaned forward, her voice low. And then James swallowed. Then nothing. No lights, no sounds, no complaints. The Whitmores vanished from the record after November 15th, 1902. The photograph of Clara, once a charming relic, now radiated with layered meaning. Taken sometime that year, perhaps mere weeks before her family's disappearance, her expression seemed to transform under the weight of this knowledge. Her smile, bright and unwavering, no longer looked merely joyful. It seemed purposeful, almost defiant, as if she had understood she was capturing more than a simple likeness. It was a message, a preservation of something precious, meant to endure long after everything else was gone. Wait. Jennifer interrupted, her eyes fixed on the documents spread across her screen. I found something in the county property transfer records. The Whitmore estate was sold directly to the federal government in December 1902, barely a month after the investigation. But here's the problem. There's no record of Theodore or Clara signing the transfer, no receipt of payment, nothing to suggest a legal transaction ever took place. The weight of her words settled heavily on the group. It wasn't just that the government had investigated Theodore Whitmore. They had taken his land, his laboratory, and perhaps his life's work without acknowledgement. Sarah felt a tightness in her chest. If the property had been seized, what had happened to the family themselves? Why had Clara's photograph, the pendant with its coded formulas, been sealed away in stone rather than preserved openly? As dusk wrapped itself around the excavation site, the team understood they were no longer dealing with a simple curiosity from the past. They had stumbled into the shadows of a century-old cover-up, a chilling precedent of how fragile scientific innovation could become when it clashed with power. Theodore Whitmore and his daughter were no longer just names in an old photograph. They were the victims of a story erased from history. Determined to push further, Sarah reached out to academic colleagues across the country, requesting any trace of Whitmore's work journal references, patent filings, even private correspondences from around 1900. Elizabeth, tireless as ever, expanded her genealogical search, trying to follow the family's trail beyond their abrupt disappearance. The results were unsettling. Patent records showed Theodore had filed several applications between 1899 and 1901, all dealing with electrical transmission and energy storage concepts far ahead of his peers. Yet after 1902, the record went silent. No patents, no journal articles, no lectures. It's as if someone scrubbed him out of the scientific record, James muttered, scanning the fragmented entries. A man at the forefront of this kind of work doesn't just stop. He's either silenced or... His voice trailed off. Elizabeth's genealogical digging proved just as haunting. She traced Theodore's marriage to Margaret Hartwell in 1892, Clara's birth in 1894, and the family's move to Pennsylvania in 1897. But beyond November 1902, the trail ended. No death certificates, no remarriages, no property acquisitions. They had been erased, not just from science, but from existence. The team debated theories deep into the night. Had the government relocated the Whitmores under assumed identities, burying their names to protect classified knowledge? Had the family escaped abroad, living in exile with their discoveries hidden? Or more chillingly, had something far darker occurred during those 3 days when federal investigators descended on the estate? While the others speculated, Jennifer returned to the evidence they had unearthed in the workshop, convinced the artifacts themselves might hold the answers. She leaned over the table, her gloved fingers brushing carefully across the surviving diagrams and journal pages, searching for the detail everyone else had overlooked. Jennifer's voice carried both triumph and unease as she guided the others to the laptop screen. I've been analyzing the photograph itself, the paper fibers, the chemical traces of the developing solution. Everything matches the photographic methods of 1902. But there's something else. She zoomed in on the background behind Clara, the crisp magnification revealing details invisible before. Look at the house windows, she urged. Sarah bent closer, her eyes narrowing. And then she saw it faint, almost ghost-like, but unmistakable. Reflected in the glass was the figure of a man, most likely Theodore Whitmore, hunched over an imposing piece of electrical equipment. Even blurred by distance, his stance radiated urgency, the air of a man working against time. A chill rippled through Sarah as the significance sank in. This photograph was not just a portrait of a smiling child. It was a frozen glimpse into the final moments of a family, before their discoveries drew the gaze of powers far larger than themselves. Recognizing that their investigation had reached a level requiring deeper expertise, Dr. Mitchell expanded their circle. She reached out to Dr. Robert Chen, an MIT physicist specializing in the history of electrical engineering, and Dr. Maria Santos, a genealogist with privileged access to military and governmental archives. Within days, both were on board. On a video call, Dr. Chen's enthusiasm was barely contained as he examined Theodore's diagrams. "These aren't simply advanced for 1902. He explained, holding the papers up to the camera with almost reverent care. "Some of these concepts wouldn't formally appear until the 1930s or 1940s. Look at this configuration. It's a precursor to resonant inductive coupling." Whitmore wasn't dabbling. He was inventing decades ahead of schedule. But it was Dr. Santos who delivered the most startling revelation. Through her government contacts, she had gained access to files only recently declassified. The Whitmore case wasn't isolated. She revealed her tone grave. It was part of a broader initiative, something called Project Oversight. She paused, letting the words sink in. This program systematically monitored, and when necessary, silenced or relocated civilian scientists whose work was deemed a threat to national security. Electrical research, energy transmission, even early aeronautics. If it moved too far ahead of its time, oversight stepped in. The documents she displayed on the screen, though scarred with blacked-out lines, left no doubt. The government had not merely observed Theodore Whitmore. They had targeted him. Clara's pendant, the secret journals, the vanished family, it all fit the larger pattern. The Whitmore's disappearance was not a mystery of chance, but the deliberate work of a government program intent on controlling knowledge itself. Theodore Whitmore's fate, long obscured by silence and rumor, finally came into focus. He had not been executed or permanently imprisoned as the team once feared. Instead, the declassified files revealed a chilling compromise. Project Oversight had presented him with two options: continue his groundbreaking research under strict government supervision at a classified facility, or disappear with his family under new identities, severing ties with his past. According to the surviving records, Theodore had chosen the latter. Dr. Santos laid out the evidence in measured tones. The Whitmores were relocated to Oregon, rebranded as the Westfields. Theodore became Thomas Westfield, his wife. Margaret retained her name, and Clara was renamed Catherine. Elizabeth immediately dove into Oregon archives under these new identities, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Within hours, the puzzle pieces aligned. She traced birth certificates, school records, and eventually marriage and death certificates. Clara Catherine lived until 1987. Elizabeth announced softly. She married, had children, and worked as a mathematics teacher. She never once spoke publicly about her early life or her father's work. She hesitated, then added, but she did donate her personal papers to the Oregon Historical Society before her death. Her obituary confirms it. The revelation struck like lightning. Clara's pendant had not only carried encoded equations, but symbolized the survival of her family and the quiet preservation of knowledge the world had not yet been ready to accept. That single photograph, the girl's defiant smile in 1902, was no longer just a relic. It was the beginning of a legacy deliberately hidden and safeguarded across generations. The team's journey to Portland felt like stepping into a time machine. Dr. Mitchell, Dr. Chen, and Dr. Santos joined forces, anticipation heavy in the air, as they met with Dr. Helen Morrison, the Oregon Historical Society's curator. Morrison's expression betrayed both curiosity and relief. The Westfield collection, she explained, is extensive, but we've never fully cataloged it. It's been waiting for someone who knew what to look for. When the climate-controlled doors opened, the team was stunned. The Catherine Westfield collection filled an entire room, rows of archival boxes, stacked neatly, each labeled and preserved. Inside were meticulously kept documents, faded photographs, and carefully wrapped artifacts. Dr. Chen's hands trembled as he unfolded technical drawings far more sophisticated than anything they had uncovered in Pennsylvania. "She saved everything," he whispered in awe. "Complete circuit designs, mathematical proofs, experimental notes. This isn't just research. This is decades of scientific progress hidden in plain sight." But it was the personal treasures that cut deepest. Among the boxes lay Clara's own diary, its entries written in a childish code she had perfected over time. Page after page recounted her father's experiments, their forced relocation, and her own role as silent witness and keeper of the family's truth. For the first time in more than a century, the Whitmore's voices spoke again, their story preserved not only in formulas and diagrams, but in the words of a daughter who had grown into both guardian and storyteller. Elizabeth painstakingly worked through Clara's coded diary until the family's story unfolded with heartbreaking clarity. She read aloud one entry, dated October 30th, 1902. "Papa says the government men are afraid of his machines. They think he might hurt people, but Papa only wants to help. He says we must hide his work until the world grows wise enough to use it safely." The words written by an 8-year-old carried the weight of sacrifice and foresight. Among the artifacts sat the pendant itself, nestled in a silk-lined box, as though Clara had known its significance would one day demand reverence. Alongside it lay a letter she had written for her descendants, explaining that her father had encoded his most important discoveries into the delicate engravings, and that on their final night in Pennsylvania, she had hidden the photograph behind the stone wall so that someone someday would find it and understand. Dr. Chen leaned over the diagrams, his voice measured but reverent. Theodore was right to be cautious. In 1902, attempting large-scale energy transmission with this level of understanding could have been catastrophic. But the principles, look at them. They're not only sound, they're still being explored in modern physics. He tapped a set of equations that astonishingly aligned with contemporary research on wireless power. As the team delved deeper into the Westfield collection, a new truth emerged. Clara had not been content to simply preserve her father's notebooks. She had quietly advanced his work herself. Her diary's lesson notes and private papers revealed that she wove fragments of Theodore's suppressed theories into her teaching, subtly passing along ideas that wouldn't appear in mainstream curricula for decades. Her students had been learning pieces of a scientific legacy that had skipped an entire generation of official recognition. Dr. Mitchell held the original photograph in her hands, her eyes tracing Clara's radiant smile. It no longer looked like the innocent joy of childhood, but rather the knowing expression of a guardian. Clara had understood even at 8 years old that she was part of something extraordinary, something worth protecting until the world was ready. What had begun with the brushing away of dirt in a Pennsylvania field had become a revelation of staggering scope. The story of innovation crushed by fear, a family uprooted and erased a daughter who quietly carried her father's torch through a lifetime of secrecy and a hidden archive that had endured for over a century. In Clara Whitmore's eyes frozen forever in that 1902 photograph, the team could now see more than a child. They saw the wisdom of someone who knew that knowledge can be both powerful and perilous, and that some secrets are worth keeping until the world itself grows ready to receive them.